Good afternoon. And on behalf of the Encounter, welcome to all those joining us here at the Metropolitan Pavilion and those joining us online. I'm Everett Price, a foreign policy advisor, and I will be moderating this event. Before starting, I'd like to thank AVSI USA for its generous support in organizing this conversation. A torn open wound. The title for this discussion is drawing off the theme of the Encounter this year, Tearing Open the Sleeping Soul. In the explanation of the theme, we find these lines, that we are ill at ease with our apathy because we are made to desire. We feel empty when we check out because we are meant to be checked in. These words describe the way many people around the world feel in the face of Hamas's surprise attack on Israel on October 7th and the ensuing conflict in Gaza, which every day threatens to spread beyond. Apathy is practically inconceivable in the face of these realities because our hearts instinctually recognize that something great is at stake. The desire to organize this panel arose out of this very recognition that we cannot look away, but that instead we want to look deeper, as painful as it may be. Indeed, a wound has been torn open. This is a wound that is felt first and foremost by the Israeli and Palestinian people. On October 7th, Hamas terrorists based on the Gaza Strip mounted a surprise attack on Israel. In brazen and cold-blooded assaults targeting primarily civilians in numerous kibbutzim and a music festival, plus several security installations, these terrorists murdered approximately 1,200 people and took 240 hostage. This was the single deadliest day in Israeli history and the largest single-day loss of life for Jews since the Holocaust. In the following weeks and months, Israel has mounted a widespread military campaign to end Hamas's rule over the Gaza Strip, which Hamas controlled since 2007. This assault has claimed the lives of nearly 29,000 people, according to the health ministry in Gaza. This military operation has faced widespread international condemnation for its toll on civilians, its widespread impact on Gaza's 2.2 million residents, and its uncertain final objective. But if a wound has been torn open, it suggests that the initial injury was in the past and efforts have been made to heal it. This injury dates back at least to the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, which, on the one hand, is remembered by Palestinians as the Nakba, or catastrophe, when around 700,000 Palestinians were displaced from the land that would become Israel. And on the other hand, is remembered by Israelis as their victory over the combined forces of 4 Arab armies that sought to squelch the dream of Israeli statehood in its infancy. The ensuing decades saw countless efforts to reconcile these two sides and to find an enduring arrangement for coexistence, but to no avail. Today, we have invited 2 distinguished commentators deeply familiar with Palestinian and Israeli points of view to help us make sense of the facts and implications of the events we are reading about every day in the headlines. We are here to take seriously our intent to understand what is going on, why it is happening, and how we are meant to respond. To that end, we are honored to have with us, first to my left, Jacob Siegel, a contributing editor at Tablet Magazine, a Jewish magazine about the world. Jacob is also the author of a forthcoming book from Henry Holt exposing the history of the war on disinformation and how it created an American censorship industrial complex. He hosts Manifesto, a podcast with the novelist Phil Cly. We also have with us Shadi Hamid, a columnist and member of the editorial board at the Washington Post and a research professor of Islamic studies at Fuller Seminary. Previously, he was a senior fellow at Brookings Institution. He is the author of several books, including the most recently published The Problem of Democracy. He is also the co-founder of Wisdom of Crowds, a podcast, newsletter, and debate platform. Join me in welcoming them, please. So, gentlemen, thank you for being with us today, for having this conversation, for helping us to grapple with these questions that I was trying to tee up in the intro. And wanted to start off, before we dig into the substance of the conflict we're here to talk about, just to ask kind of a more personal question about what are the factors that have influenced the most your personal approach to this conflict? Kind of what do you bring to the table when you think about this? Jacob, we can start with you.
Thank you, Everett. Very glad to be here at the Encounter. I live in Israel, in central Israel, and I'm raising my 2 children there, so I have a very personal stake in the conflict, and yet I'm an American, and my formative experiences were in America, I served in the U.S. Army. I served in Iraq in 2006 and 2007, and in Afghanistan in 2012, and subsequently, as a writer, I've spent a lot of time thinking about both the philosophy and the outcomes of the American way of war. And I think, I have developed a critique of that way of war based both on its own pretenses, its own self-understanding, and what it has accomplished or failed to accomplish in the world. And, if I could summarize it, I think it's been a disastrous failure, the American way of war since September 11th, 2001. So, I don't profess to be an expert on Israeli politics. And in fact, I think I've written 2 pieces on Israeli politics in the past 5 years. One of them was an essay that I think maybe we'll talk about later, arguing to end U.S. aid to Israel. And prior to that, I wrote something in 2018 criticizing the kind of militarism and bluster of Benjamin Netanyahu and the ruling faction in Israel. So I have written a bit about Israel, but the real sort of focus of my analysis has been on the American way of war and the way in which it's shaped the global security environment, and particularly in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. Shadi.
Yeah, so I guess Jacob and I are both children of the post 9/11 era. 9/11 is really one of the main reasons I decided to go into politics and policy. It happened 2 weeks into my freshman year in college. And really ever since then, I've been thinking about U.S. foreign policy and studying it. And I've also lived many years in the Middle East. I'm not Palestinian, but I am Arab and originally Egyptian. And for anyone who grows up in an Arab household, the Palestinian plight is always going to be discussed to one degree or another on the dinner table. And, I think in some ways, the plight of Palestinians is a proxy for a deeper set of issues. I think when we talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what makes it so difficult and emotional is that we're not just talking about Gaza, we're not just talking about Palestine, but we're talking about something that really has been at the heart of a kind of broader Arab sense of loss. Growing up, we used to kind of hear things that we used to be one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever seen, and that could be Arab, Muslim, or some mix thereof. And, Arabs went through one of the most precipitous declines in human history. And if you look at the Middle East now, it is pretty much an unmitigated disaster, governed by brutal dictatorships, by really kind of thwarted dreams and hopes of more than 200 million people. And so I think that when we're trying to understand why the Palestinian issue becomes such a proximate one or such an emotional one, we have to also think about it in a broader context of failure. So I have to be honest, I don't actually like writing a whole lot about Israel-Palestine, and it's something that for a long time I maybe not necessarily avoided, but it wasn't my favorite thing. When I started at the Washington Post, which was just a few months ago, I started actually the week before October 7th. And I made actually the day before October 7th, it was the night of October 6th, I was at a party with some friends, some of whom were journalists in DC, and I told a journalist friend, I'm excited about this new job. No one cares about the Middle East anymore. So I'm looking forward to writing about where my heart really is, which is in the role of religion in public life. And I wake up the following morning and everything changed. So my first 5 columns for the Washington Post were on Gaza and Israel. and I feel like I've sort of been thrust back into something, and it's been quite hard. I actually find it quite difficult to talk about Gaza, and I've actually taken a break from writing about it, so my last 3 columns have not been about that. Actually, oddly enough, my most recent column a couple days ago was about polyamory. So so pretty much I run the gamut of topics, I guess you could say. But I think that I'll just end by saying that this reminds me of the post 9/11 era a little bit, where I think it felt very personal and very challenging to be an Arab or to be a Muslim in America. And this reminds me of that time, that there's an intensity and sort of like a sense of difficulty and tragedy for, I think, many of us who are Arab and Muslim Americans. It's hit us really hard, and we can get into why that might be the case, but also a sense that our own government, in this case, the Biden administration, has been unquestioningly on one side and has not been balanced and has not constrained the Israeli military operation. So I think that a lot of us have had to contend with this question of the country that we love taking a side or being very much supporting a tragedy of really nearly unprecedented proportions, at least in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This number of Gazans being killed or being displaced, it is truly unprecedented in that regard. So that's sort of, I think, maybe a way to kind of introduce my own thinking.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you for sharing that, because I think it's already touched on a lot of the themes that we're going to hopefully draw out over the course of this conversation. And we'll definitely get to the role of the United States and your respective views of the U.S. role in this conflict and in foreign policy writ large. But we'll start with just October 7th to kind of start with what for most of us kind of put this conflict back into the headlines and into the public awareness after, as you were saying, kind of some time where it seemed to be on the back burner. So just be interested in both of your perspectives on what happened on October 7th and more importantly, maybe why. Why did it happen?
Well, what happened was a long-planned, thoroughly rehearsed, rather spectacularly successful cross-border combined arms operation by Hamas targeting Israeli civilians and carried out with what we now know to be the full support of Iran and through joint planning with Hezbollah. So this was not Hamas acting in isolation. It wasn't Hamas, carrying this out simply or even principally on behalf of the Palestinian people. This was a Iranian-backed, really intensive military operation, the likes of which had been more the sort of Hezbollah MO and had not been seen from Hamas prior to this. And, the military operation, the praxis, the practical reality of the Hamas political ideology was to slaughter hundreds of Israeli civilians and then slaughter thousands of Israeli civilians, slaughter hundreds of Israeli civilians and bring hundreds back as hostages. Why this happened, I think both has to do with Hamas's understanding of its own position in the Middle East and its understanding of its position vis-a-vis Iran and the US in a sort of changing global order. I think Hamas recognized an opportunity based both on the US security posture in the Middle East, Iran pushing for something that could destabilize the Arab-Israeli normalization that was taking place. And also, finally, a recognition that the sort of on a tactical and operational level that the Israeli security architecture had broken down and that the Israelis had been lulled into a false understanding of what Hamas was and what it wanted. So you can see this, for instance, in the negotiations prior to the October 7th attack on work permits for Gazan civilians. So there was an increase in work permits going to Gazan civilians to work in Israel, which reflected a understanding and a broadly shared consensus that Hamas could be induced to moderation through economic incentives, through kind of improvements in quality of life. And this was broadly shared within the kind of DC foreign policy class and also in Israel itself by both major parties. And by the way, this is not something that only the right wing in Israel thought or only the left wing in Israel thought. This was one of these kind of generational, you could call it a generational consensus. Now it's obviously a kind of generational delusion. But they thought that they could incentivize Hamas to be a kind of rational actor and a moderate group. And it's clear that Hamas was aware of that understanding, manipulated that understanding, played into that understanding, in other words, to produce a kind of false sense of security in Israel that allowed them to carry out the October 7th attack.
Mm-hmm. Shadi, what's your feeling on all that?
Yeah, well, I agree with Jacob that it wasn't just Israelis who were lulled into complacency. I think the international community and certainly the U.S. had been lulled into complacency. I think there's always a tendency to think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can be ignored or pushed to the side. And there was a sense that it was being managed. And it's interesting that National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, I believe it was 8 days before October 7th, he said something to an audience along the lines of, the Middle East hasn't been this quiet in 2 decades. It's not a joke. It's really hard to imagine that this was the kind of self-satisfaction we had among U.S. policymakers. And the fact of the matter is that there's an Israel-Hamas war every few years, and then each time we think, oh, well, it passed this time, now we can move on to other things. And I think the basic lesson for all of us going forward is that the Middle East is never going to be quiet. The Israeli-Palestinian scene is never going to be quiet unless there's a real commitment to, I would say, a two-state solution. Some of my friends and colleagues who are on the quote-unquote pro-Palestinian side, I don't love these labels, but I think that if we have to use them, that is the side that I lean towards. They might say a one-state solution and that sort of thing, which I don't think is very realistic. But I do think that this has been, the broader conflict has been festering to one degree or another for many decades now. And I think that there was a big debate after October 7th, where do you start the clock? Or how do you talk about a tragedy? I mean, what Hamas did was horrific, and I think it was a surprise to most observers of the region, including perhaps to some Hamas. I mean, there's some debate about who in Hamas knew about the attacks before they actually happened. We don't really have to get into that. But I do think that there's this difficulty of talking about a tragedy afterwards, and it reminds me a little bit of 9/11, that after 9/11 happened, I think that there always has to be an effort to understand why terrorism happens, because the only way to prevent it from happening again is to understand the contextual factors that lead to it, the so-called root causes. And that's something that I think Americans eventually did post 9/11. And I think there has to be a similar effort here. And if we just start the clock on October 7th and say Hamas is evil, which is fine to say, and that Hamas has to be destroyed, that gives us a very short-term approach, and it doesn't actually address the broader context of a conflict that has to, at some level, be addressed. Otherwise, we'll keep on going back into this cycle indefinitely. And there has been a decades-long occupation. Gaza has been in desperate straits for ever since 2007 with the land, air, and sea blockade. And we thought that we could just ignore Gaza and continue along with this indefinitely, and that's just not going to happen. And I hope that next time around, which is to say this time around, that there will be some effort at putting Gaza as a priority and thinking about how to rebuild and reconstruct, but also to move towards a real peace process instead of just ignoring the 2.2 million Gazans who have been there with little hope and little to look forward to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
can I respond to that? I have a fundamentally different understanding of the role of Gaza and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, not only in terms of what led to October 7th, but also in terms of how the U.S. has approached that. So, there's an argument that I hear made that October 7th was in some ways a response to the marginalization of Gazans and of the Palestinian plight. And I don't think that's correct. The evidence I would present is that the marginalization had occurred much more dramatically under the Trump administration, right? So if it was the sort of sidelining of the Palestinian plight that was the cause or even the immediate pretext for this kind of attack, we would have seen it under the Trump administration. We didn't. And then, to that point, there hasn't actually been a war between Israel and Hamas every couple of years. There was a war in 2008, there was a war in 2014, then there was a war in 2021, and then there was a war in 2023. So there's a
which is about every few years, every 5 years,
with a large gap, with a large gap in the middle of it, and the large gap in the middle of it is the Trump administration, when I think everybody, pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian people would agree that the deliberate effort of the Trump administration was to say, we don't have to solve the Israeli-Palestinian crisis first. We can achieve this Arab-Israeli normalization. Now, the Trump administration did have its deal of the century, so they didn't ignore it altogether. But, that was the criticism from pro-Palestinian people, was that the Trump administration was deliberately sidelining this. And yet, the outcome, if we can all forget about the kind of our understanding of the politics of Trump versus Obama, Biden for a second, if we're just looking at a timeline, when do these wars flare up? It's not quite every few years, because there's this large gap in the middle, and that gap happens to correspond to the period that, the argument from pro-Palestinian people was that this was when the marginalization was the most intense. Biden comes into office. His day one decision in office is to restart funding to UNRWA, for instance, which Trump had cut off, and to kind of recenter the plight of the Palestinians historically, and also the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and to return that to a kind of preeminence that it had lost. So it seems to me that if we're not just looking at this in theoretical terms, what do we feel about root causes, but if we're studying the kind of correlation between policies and events, it shows something else. It paints a different picture.
Very, very quickly, because I know you probably want to move on, Everett, but I would just take issue with the idea that the Biden administration prioritized the Palestinian plight. There was nothing of the sort. Biden's policy has been to double down on Trump's, which is to take the Abraham Accords, which were designed, as you said, around sidelining the Palestinians and ignoring them. That has been at the heart of the Biden administration's approach. And I would actually say that Biden has been, just not to mince words, terrible when it comes to anything relating to Palestinians. The way he talks about Palestinians is incredibly disrespectful. There's a very memorable moment that went viral a few weeks after October 7th, where a reporter asked Biden about the civilian death toll, and Biden just dismisses it and says, well, we can't even trust the numbers. And yes, there can be a legitimate debate about exactly how many have been killed, but when 7,000 or 8,000 have been killed, and it's like, oh, is it 1,000 less or 500 more? And the heart of the question was people wanted Biden to express a basic sympathy for the loss of Palestinian lives, but he wasn't even able to do that. And time again, reporters have asked senior U.S. officials to actually just show that they see Palestinians as human beings deserving of dignity and equal human worth. And I think that's what really hurts a lot of us. I'm not someone who would argue that Israel doesn't have a right to defend itself. Israel does have a right to defend itself. But the complete lack of balance in how Biden actually talks about both sides, so to speak, is I think what really makes it hard to understand. I mean, Obama would speak with at least some empathy towards Palestinians and Israelis. He could speak to the historical narratives on both sides. And I think both sidesism is something that's often maligned, that you have to take one side or another and be clear about that. But what I want from my president is to actually acknowledge what Palestinians are going through instead of saying war is tragic. And that's what spokesperson John Kirby, he had that another memorable quote that kind of went viral as well. You know, war is tragic. Lives are lost. This is what happens. And that kind of insensitivity is something that I think has been at the heart of the Biden administration's approach, and which is why, and this is maybe a bigger issue, why so many Arab and Muslim Americans are saying that they can't bring themselves to vote for Biden later this year if the policy doesn't change, because there is that kind of personal element that, as bad as we think Trump is, and the act of voting is an act of conscience, and I think it's going to be hard for a lot of Arab Americans to actually vote for a president, Joe Biden, who just doesn't seem to care at a very fundamental level.
This is a very interesting disagreement because you kind of look at the same picture and you see very different takeaways of Biden is doing too little or he's doing way too much. And so I definitely want to dig more into that. But you've raised this issue of the root causes and kind of what is this conflict really about? And Jacob, you were also talking about how you had this period of conflict, then you had this period where there was no conflict. And that raises to me the question of is there a sustainable kind of status quo for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Is there a coexistence that's on offer either or now or in the future that would make this a place that can actually live in peace? And I kind of welcome your thoughts on this framing, but it seems like there's two different communities with aspirations that have found those aspirations in conflict. I guess maybe Israel's desire to live in peace on the one hand is one characterization, and then the Palestinians to have self-determination and statehood the way that Israel achieves statehood in the first half of the 20th century. What do you make of that kind of characterization? And I guess this is starting to get us to the question of, do we need a two-state solution? Is there a sustainable coexistence that can be had between the two?
I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows. Mm-hmm. And I don't presume that I can provide an answer to that. Time will tell. I mean, it doesn't mean that it's not a worthy goal. And Palestinian self-determination and Palestinian statehood are neither equivalent nor would I want to rank them at the moment. I would say the same, by the way, about Jewish self-determination or Jewish sovereignty and Jewish statehood in Israel. Not the same thing. They are, statehood is the vehicle now for sovereignty and self-determination, but that hasn't always historically been the case. There are other models of sovereignty and self-determination, and I simply don't know what the formula for peaceful long-term coexistence is, nor do I assume as a given just because I view that as the desirable or more moral outcome that it's necessarily achievable. I do think that insofar as something like that does exist, insofar as there's a solution, it will come from Israelis and Palestinians, and perhaps with the assistance, guidance of regional powers. But my faith in the ability of technocrats in Washington to engineer a solution to this, to snap their fingers and say 2 states and expect that to actually meaningfully improve the lives of anyone on either side of the conflict is nil. I have no faith in that. I look at Afghanistan, I look at Ukraine now, I look at, COVID policy, I look at any number of issues across the board where the kind of technocratic consensus has been not only mistaken or misguided, but disastrous in its own way. And I have no faith, nor do I have any desire in awarding power to people in think tanks in Washington to figure this out. Now, it doesn't mean that there's not a role for outside powers, particularly regional powers, who I think are more staked in the actual realities of the conflict and probably have more credibility. But the kind of ideological and even social appeal of the 2-state solution, insofar as it's palatable to people across the board as a political formula, doesn't mean that it can just be grafted on to the conflict and work because people want it to work. There has to be actual buy-in from the people involved. And I think the last thing I would say about this is the resurrection of the 2-state solution model. And again, I'm not opposed to a 2-state solution, but there's a 2-state solution, and then there's, quote unquote, the 2-state solution, which is just, the default formula among the kind of foreign policy mandarins and technocratic class in Brussels and DC and elsewhere. And I see no reason, given how much has already been invested in that formula over decades, to assume that now, just because there's been a brutal massacre in Israel and then a brutal war in Gaza, that now is the moment it's going to work because the Biden administration decides that it wants it to work now.
Right. Shadi, I definitely want to get your reaction to that. But I also have, we've raised this question about, how about I get your reaction to that first, and then maybe
if you just want to add something, feel free.
No, that's all right.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay. So, so I think there's the short-term priority, which in my mind is to mitigate civilian harm. There is a real risk now that Israel is going to launch a major offensive into Rafah, which will be devastating. And it's just worth, I think, reminding folks of just the scale of disaster thus far, which is more than 80% of the Gazan population displaced. It's a pretty remarkable number. And 28,000 killed. If we assume that 1/3 of them are combatants based on previous conflicts, that's actually probably a conservative estimate. But if we grant that, then 2/3, give or take, are civilians. We are talking about a massive number of people, of civilians killed. And I remember that I did a comparison with how many people were directly killed as a result of U.S. military operations in Iraq from 2003 to 2011. And according to Iraq Body Count, which tracked this, the number was about 14,000 Iraqi civilians directly killed by U.S. military operations. After just about 100 days in the Israel-Gaza war, that number was exceeded. It was at around 16,000 at that point, 16,000 out of 24,000, if we want to use the 2/3 number. It's the kind of scale that is really shocking, and this is where the question is, can the U.S. do more to put pressure on Israel? Again, not to say that Israel doesn't have the right to defend itself, but to say that there has to be a real commitment to taking civilian protection seriously, and there hasn't even been the pretense of that when it comes to Israeli military operations. That's step one. Then in the medium to long term, I don't think there is another option besides a or the 2-state solution, unless you want to start talking about something akin to a binational state, which I think would be even worse to Israelis, and it's also would go against I think that Jews have a right to exist have a right to self-determination, and Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state. I mean, that's the whole premise. And a binational state would not be aligned with that. And why would Israeli Jews want to be subsumed under a kind of binational Arab Jewish state where they might at some point be the minority in their own land? That to me seems like correcting one injustice with another. So the other option is annexation, indefinite military occupation. Maybe I'm being naive, but I would like us to avoid those scenarios to the extent possible. So just by process of elimination, I think there's only one realistic option, which is where you have a Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem as its capital, living side by side. And the only way, in my view, that can happen is if the U.S., which is the primary patron of Israel militarily, Israel is dependent on the U.S. to be able to have one of the region's strongest and most technologically advanced militaries. And I totally understand that Israelis are in retribution mode right now and aren't necessarily in the mood to think about protecting Palestinian civilian lives. I get it. That's how war works. But for us as Americans, we don't have to go along with that approach. We can be critical to our friends. Israel is a longtime ally, and we can say to Israelis, this might be okay with you, but it's not okay with us because our military hardware and our military assistance is being implicated in this civilian tragedy, and we as Americans are not okay with it. And I think that's where there's a lot of leverage that can be had going forward, and that's where I do think that for all the faults of Washington officials, who else is going to put pressure on Israel? The U.S. is really the only party that has that legitimacy and leverage with Israel going forward.
Yeah, I guess the big question on a lot of people's minds right now is, okay, we're several months, I guess, now into this Israeli operation in the Gaza Strip. And what is the end state that is envisioned by the Israelis who are creating the strategy and mounting the offensive in Gaza? Because as you said, it doesn't necessarily have to be a two-state solution. And the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, has said that he rejects the idea of a two-state solution. So has there been an articulated end game for what the Israeli military is doing in Gaza right now? What do you see as the future of the people of Gaza in light of what's happening here?
I have not seen an articulated political endgame coming formally from the Prime Minister's office in Israel, which I think is a real problem and a very significant problem that has gotten a lot of criticism and deserves a lot of criticism, because the failure to enunciate an endgame, which sometimes statesmen will attempt to portray as strategic ambiguity, but in a democratic society, what it means is that they don't even have to formulate it to themselves. So that my faith in Netanyahu and his cabinet to have some brilliant endgame that they're keeping private is very low, or perhaps non-existent. However, there is a very clear military strategy and a military end state, and Netanyahu has laid it out, and it has three components: destroy Hamas, demilitarize Gaza, de-radicalize Gaza. I think the first two components of that are essential. Destroy Hamas and demilitarize Gaza are, practically speaking, achievable goals that relate to a clearly defined end state, and in strategic terms, they match ends to means in a way that is legible and achievable. The last part is a problem for me, de-radicalize Gaza, because I don't think it's the responsibility, nor is it necessarily within the capacity of Israel to ideologically transform or culturally transform Gazan society, and I think exactly that kind of thinking lays at the root of the catastrophic U.S. military adventurism in the Middle East. So Shadi made the comparison to Iraq. I think that's the wrong comparison to make. For one thing, Iraq was a a total strategic failure for the United States that not only didn't make Americans safer, but ended up, the strategic legacy of the Iraq War was to empower Iran and to turn Iran into a regional hegemon. That's what the US accomplished in Iraq after a decade. And thousands of soldiers killed, and I think actually many more Iraqis killed than even the numbers you provided suggest. But the Iraq model, the so-called population-centric or counterinsurgency model of warfare in which the US launched a war of choice, a deliberate war of intervention to transform Iraqi society, to bring democracy to the Middle East, was an imperial war. And that's not what Israel is fighting in Gaza. It's not an imperial war. It's not a war of choice. It's a war that was brought to Israel on its own doorstep. And the appropriate analogy, in my opinion, in technical terms, if you can for a moment, leave the sort of ethical considerations out of it, not because I don't think that there are necessary ethical questions to ask about any war, even a just war, but just to sort of compare like to like, we should be looking at the campaign in Mosul, right? So in Mosul, you had ISIS, the Islamic State, which had embedded itself within a civilian population, roughly the same size as Gaza, around 2 million people in Mosul. Far smaller ISIS force. There were about 3,000 fighters in Mosul compared to something like 30,000 Hamas fighters in Gaza. And the ISIS fighters in Mosul had far less advanced weaponry and technical sophistication. So, they were fighting with tactical vehicles, meaning pickup trucks and some belt-fed machine guns. And the campaign to liberate Mosul, which the United States led, which destroyed something like 60% of Mosul, killed somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 civilians. These numbers may be new or surprising to some people because there was not a fanatical global obsession with the unbelievable, horrific civilian toll in Mosul, a 9-month operation to liberate Mosul. I think both because Mosul and Moslawis don't have the same kind of symbolic potency and magnetism that the Palestinian cause has across the world. And that was a 9-month operation, very similar in many ways in terms of the scale of destruction, in terms of the very intensive US bombing in Mosul. And it led to the liberation of Mosul from the Islamic State, something which I think most people here supported. And it came at an incredible cost to Moslawis. Now, the major difference, I should say, between the campaign in Mosul and the one in Gaza, again, in Gaza against a far larger force, enmeshed into Gazan society, Gazan civil society. In Gaza, of course, there was a tunnel infrastructure larger than the New York subway system that was dug underneath civilian facilities, including schools, hospitals, UN facilities, effectively subsidized actually by international humanitarian aid. And so there are ways in which these are quite directly comparable, and then there are ways in which they're different. And the main difference is that in Mosul, something like half the population left. Half the civilian population left before the joint US-Iraqi campaign, which took 9 months. And in Gaza, of course, we know that the kind of international humanitarian consensus was that no Gazans should be able to leave, because for civilians to leave Gaza, Egypt, for its own reasons, I think both political, ideological, and security considerations, didn't want to allow Palestinians into the Sinai, and there was, I think, a general consensus that allowing civilians to leave, which has been the norm in every other modern war, particularly in intensive, necessarily brutal urban campaigns, it's been the norm for civilians to flee. Here, somehow, the moral logic was inverted, and it became ethnic cleansing to allow civilians to flee.
Well, yes, I mean, Jacob, because that's what happened before in the Nakba. I mean, that is key to the Palestinian narrative in 1948, as Everett mentioned in the beginning. Last time Palestinians left their homes, they weren't able to come back, and that is the defining moment in the Palestinian national memory and consciousness. And there is no guarantee that if Gazans left and were stuck in some tents in Egypt, and also why would they want to live under a brutal dictatorship in Egypt that doesn't even care about them, instead of being in their homeland and having that attachment to the land.
Just to clarify, I was saying that they would want to be temporarily relocated so that they could live.
But there's no guarantee that they would come back.
Why couldn't the U.S. provide that guarantee if it has the ability to exert this kind of influence?
Well, I mean, I think that the problem is there are many in the Israeli ruling coalition right now on the far right who actually do openly and explicitly believe in ethnic cleansing and have said that in the clearest way possible. They are part of the government right now. So, I mean, I would never want to be in a position of encouraging Palestinians to leave when there aren't ironclad guarantees that they would be able to return. And what would they even return to? Gaza is being destroyed. I mean, the whole northern part of Gaza is basically destroyed. And now there is a real risk that Rafah, the one part that was supposed to be safe, let's just remember the Palestinians were told that this is where they would be safe to go towards the Rafah border. Now Israel is saying that this is the part that is going to come under potential bombardment. We don't know yet. And my hope is that we can still avoid that. But basically, nowhere is safe. And there's no guarantee that Gazans will have anywhere to return to, anywhere in their land. Land is important. It's something you can't just tell people, hey, go live in Egypt for a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do want to get a little bit into the internal dynamics because I feel like what's playing out kind of internationally is also a reflection of what's happening sort of domestically within these different societies and different communities. And I guess, we've talked a little bit about Israeli politics already, but there's been a shift over time in Israeli politics. I mean, at the founding of the State of Israel, it was mostly parties of the left, and the right didn't win an election until 1977. And there's been a progressive move further to the right, it seems like, in the ruling coalitions, and a larger role for some more conservative and ultra-Orthodox religious parties to have a role in coalition governments of late. Does that resonate with you as kind of a read of where Israeli politics is now? There seems to have been almost a disappearance of the left to some degree. What do you think accounts for these evolutions, and what does it mean about the way that Israeli society thinks about the conflict and the neighborhood in that they live?
Yeah, look, the evolution occurs in phases, but there was a post-1967 birth and growth of religious Zionism, which had to do with, Judea being the home of Judaism, and the return to Judea and Samaria was a sort of awakening of political religious Zionism that had always been latent in Israel and latent in Zionism, but hadn't been as politically salient. And then there's the legacy of the failure of the Oslo Accords and the failure of the Land for Peace framework, and the failure of the Israeli left to deliver on its promises. Now, what that led to, in my opinion, was a sort of collapse of imagination on the right. So there has been a rise on the political right in Israel, but the political right, to its I don't know if disgrace is the right word, but certainly to its a failure of the political right in Israel, was to have imagined that it could simply sort of keep the Palestinian issue on hold and build up the country's security, remake Israel as the startup nation, and in doing so, that would be enough. And as I said, I wrote an article in 2018 criticizing exactly this and criticizing what I saw to be the hollowness of the post-Oslo political right in Israel. I agree with their assessment of the failure of Oslo. I don't think there's any question that Oslo was a failure, and it's why I don't have any faith in returning to the kind of technocratic solutionism of Oslo. However, that doesn't mean that you simply stop working towards a solution that's not only secure for Israel, but that meaningfully provides for the aspirations of both peoples in such a way that you're not simply relying on, militarized borders and drones. And so look, the rise of the Israeli right has absolutely included people who have made some despicable statements, and some are tantamount to calls for ethnic cleansing. Some of that has also been distorted in the press. So, there was a statement from Yoav Gallant, Israeli defense minister, that was leading the war effort, that got brought up as an instance of this, in which supposedly he had referred to Palestinians as animals, and that quote, where he was supposedly referring to Palestinians as animals, had cut out the middle clause in which he explicitly was referring to Hamas. So there was a distorted quote that made it all the way to the ICJ, and that was in every newspaper around the world, at the Times, the Washington Post, everybody quoted as, look, this is an example of people at the highest levels. But it was a misrepresentation of what he had actually said. He said that, he referred to Hamas as animals the same way President Obama referred to ISIS as a cancer. So maybe that answers the question in part.
Sure. Yeah, and Shadi, similarly in the Palestinian territories, there's been this division between the Fatah government in the West Bank and the Hamas government in the Gaza Strip, and there's been this hope that over time these factions would be able to reconcile, and the Israeli government has complained over time that they don't have a partner for peace because the Palestinians are divided. How do you see that picture now, and has October 7th changed that? I mean, is there some way in which, because the Israeli reaction to the attack on October 7th was foreseeable, that the people of Gaza and the Palestinians hold Hamas accountable or responsible to some degree for what has been wrought since then?
Yeah, well, I mean, there was a partner for peace for a while. As flawed as the Palestinian Authority and President Abbas were, I mean, at least they were quote unquote moderate. I don't love those terms, but they were certainly more moderate than Hamas, and they were committed to the Oslo framework. And Benjamin Netanyahu sidelined Abbas for many years, and no headway was made since 2013 was the last real effort from the Obama administration. So I think that you've heard this refrain, there's no partner for peace. And I think it's self-serving to say that. And the Israeli officials have used that as a justification for really not doing anything in good faith to actually move towards anything resembling a peace process. Look, I think at the end of the day, I maybe overlap with Jacob a bit in that if I'm seeing this more, I go back and forth between hints of optimism and then kind of like a darker outlook, which is not all problems have solutions, and that these are two peoples who are, in some sense, irreconcilable. Israelis and Palestinians at a fundamental level hate each other currently, and we can debate for hours what the reasons are for that, but the hate is real. And if you look at the public opinion polling, maybe you can read some of the polls in a more positive way. It's not all dark, but I think that there's a big chunk of sentiment on both sides that is very unyielding towards the other side. There has been a process of dehumanization where Palestinians view Israeli civilians as fair game and where Israelis view Palestinian civilians as fair game. At some level, you ask yourself, what do you do about that? And you hope that maybe in a future generation, there could be a shift in sentiment. But I think October 7th and then the response to October 7th is going to be seared in the memory of Israelis and Palestinians for the foreseeable future. And it is very difficult to tell an Israeli, I mean, most Israelis knew someone who was killed in Hamas's attack to tell them, hey, you're going to have to be okay with some kind of, because at the end of the day, you can't eliminate 100% a group like Hamas. You can target their military commanders, and that's totally justified in my view. Anyone who was implicated in October 7th is fair game. But with Hamas, we're talking about tens of thousands, if not even more than that, of sympathizers and supporters. You can't kill everyone who is sympathetic to Hamas. And you can't kill every member of Hamas. So at some basic level, what I've argued for is that low-level and mid-level cadres, there's going to have to be some kind of approach where if some of them agree to disarm and demobilize and accept the authority of the PA and Mahmoud Abbas, that you're going to have to find a way to reincorporate them. Again, we're talking about low-level, mid-level, not the people who actually did October 7th, because you don't want a situation where you have tens of thousands of Palestinians who are sympathetic to Hamas to be on the outside playing spoiler. We learned that, I think, with de-Baathification in Iraq, when we said no one who was part of Saddam's army can be brought back in. Those people then saw the future government as a target, and they waged a rebellion for many years in a way that was devastating to the U.S. war effort. So I think at some basic level, you have to work with the actual context that you have. But I think it's very hard to tell Israelis to accept that. Similarly, it's going to be, I think, much more difficult to tell Palestinians, almost all of them who have relatives who have died in Gaza, that, hey, you're going to have to find a way to make peace or make concessions to the people who are just bombing you. That's what makes this so challenging, that those memories are going to be there for a very long time, which is why I go back to the role of the U.S. and the international community. Mm-hmm. Israelis and Palestinians themselves are in no mood to actually make peace with each other. They're going to have to be forced into it by outside powers and third parties. And we might not like the sound of that. I know it sounds weird to say, well, you have to force people to make peace or incentivize them using carrots and sticks. But at the end of the day, I don't really see what the alternative is.
Yeah, no, that's definitely something I want to get to before we close here, is your views of the role of the United States. And Jacob, you wrote in July, before October 7th, an article in Tablet called End U.S. Aid to Israel, with this concern that this outsized kind of assistance role that the United States has with Israel, as being the largest recipient of military aid, or of aid in the world from the United States, has allowed for there to be U.S. leverage over Israeli policy. And you've wanted to strive for greater autonomy and kind of ability for Israel to exert its own sovereignty in deciding its policy. Whereas, Shadi, I think, on the other hand, you've articulated it a bit today about how that leverage is key to kind of advancing the United States' moral concept that it likes to articulate often of its foreign policy, that it's striving to achieve some sort of good, and that that sort of leverage is an important tool in doing that. I'd just love you guys to say a little bit more about that. And maybe to put like a little bit of a finer point on it, should the U.S. Foreign policy try to pursue moral ends?
The U.S. policy should try to pursue ends that serve the interests of the U.S., and if the U.S. is a moral agent, those will be moral ends. So this is the classical framework of U.S. foreign policy, enunciated by John Quincy Adams. Go not in search of monsters. Don't attempt, moral crusades throughout the world. Perfect the union here. Build the city on the hill. And if you build the city on the hill here, then in protecting the interests of the United States, you will be serving the cause of freedom. Now, I think there's an eloquent case can be made, and I think Shadi made this, for why Palestinian or Arab and Muslim Americans might have felt not fully seen or fully recognized. I think the Biden administration has actually tried to do more of that than other administrations might have, but it certainly doesn't fall on deaf ears. I can understand that argument, but to me, what I want from the White House is not to recognize anyone or to see anyone's humanity. I want the White House to pursue policies that reduce war and violence in the world. I want there to be less killing and less warfare. And what we've seen over the last 20 years is that the more grandiose visions of a moral U.S. foreign policy have produced more killing, more wars, more destabilization. If the U.S. could narrow what it is trying to accomplish and focus on protecting its own peace, I think that both the U.S. and the world would be better off. So in the Middle East specifically, I think there's a sort of a very widespread misconception of what the U.S. relationship to the actors in the Middle East is. That's a testament to the success of the messaging campaigns and the way that comms have overtaken reality and, the kind of image overtaking reality, right? So there's this popular idea that the U.S. and Israel have a special relationship, and it's the U.S. and Israel with this really firm alliance against the rest of the Middle East. It's not true. That's not the actual U.S. relationship to Israel or to the greater Middle East, for that matter. The power of the Israel lobby in the U.S. has been declining for the past 2 decades. Obama never would have been able to, it didn't pass through Congress, the Iran deal, but the success of the Iran deal, which was, put through at the executive level despite congressional opposition, is a sign of how weak the kind of pro-Israel forces in the U.S. had gotten. The actual nature of the U.S. relationship to the Middle East is one of managing client states. The U.S. is a client state, Iran is a client state, Egypt is a client state. It's an imperial policy. This is nothing new. It's how empires have conducted their foreign policy for millennia. And the real problem is not the morality or lack of morality. It's that the U.S. should not be pursuing an imperial foreign policy of balancing client states. Just the last thing I would say is that incredible statement by Jake Sullivan, I believe it was 8 days before October 7th, in which Sullivan said that the Middle East is quieter than it has been in decades. The other thing Sullivan said in that speech was he laid out precisely the kind of clientelist imperial strategy I just described. He said the U.S. was integrating the region, depressurizing the region by integrating adversaries. In other words, they think they have their differences, Israel, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, but really, we can integrate all of them into our security architecture. It's been a total failure.
I'm starting to get the signal, so yeah, Shadi, please.
Okay.
I think so, but please.
Okay,
I definitely want to give you your...
And this is where I think there's some overlap between Jacob and I. So I agree that one of America's goals should be to reduce harm, to reduce killing. But the way that I think that can be done is by constraining the Netanyahu government in its current military operations. That is where there is a tremendous loss of life, and I think that that's a place where we can use our leverage. But more broadly, I'm a bit more of a moralist than probably Jacob is when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, and that's what makes this current moment very difficult for me. I'm very much a believer in the American idea and the idea that America should express its values abroad. I've been very critical that we haven't done that in the Middle East. After the Cold War, we got better with supporting democratic transitions in Latin America, East Asia, parts of Africa, after supporting right-wing dictators during the Cold War. The one region where we didn't support democracy was the Middle East. And to this day, we support these autocratic client states to the tune of billions of dollars, and we help prop them up, and we undermine democracy in the region. And it's a longer story as to why we do that. My preference, and what I've advocated for many years now, is that we should use our aid relationships with these client states like Egypt, like Saudi Arabia, and put pressure on them to open up their societies and to eventually move in a more democratic direction for morality, but also for our interests. As a fundamental outlook, would argue that autocratic regimes are inherently unstable because they go against what we know about human nature, that at some basic level, people want to have some jurisdiction over their own affairs. They want to be able to express themselves publicly. They want to have the chance to criticize their leaders when their leaders go astray. And autocratic regimes suppress the human spirit in a way that I would also say is contradictory to Christian, Muslim, and Jewish conceptions of the worth of the human individual. And so I mean, there's a broader argument there that I think is really important and probably even dear to me. It hurts me that the U.S. has not been able to live up to its own stated moral commitments in the Middle East in a way that is just very blatant. And my hope is that one day that can change. I'm not holding my breath, but I suppose hope springs eternal.
I really appreciate that. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us for this conversation. In closing, I just have a few notes. One is that at 3:15, Shadi will be available to sign his book, The Problem of Democracy, at the Human Adventure book table just outside the auditorium. Another important announcement is that your gift makes the encounter free for all. So please give generously at our donation table outside this auditorium, or in a couple of clicks at newyorkencounter.org/donate. Your donation is tax deductible. And finally, please join me in thanking our speakers and AVC USA that sponsored this event. Thanks, guys.